On the evening of October 20th, 1992, police units swiftly responded to a rural home in Phoenix, Arizona, after receiving a report of a brutal crime that claimed the life of a local businessman named Charles Gold, who was 51 years old. His wife, Carol Gold, was the one who called emergency services to report the horrific scene she encountered upon returning home that night. When the police arrived at the crime scene, they found Charles, known among his friends as Chuck, lying on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood. A quick glance at the body revealed he had received multiple gunshot wounds that killed him instantly. The scene resembled something out of an old American Western film, as Chuck was fully dressed in cowboy attire, with bullets penetrating his body in several places. He had been shot 4 times in the face and head, 3 times in his chest, and once in his arm. Investigators noted that the back door was open, and there were no signs of forced entry or violence on the door, indicating that the victim may have left the door open himself, or that the assailant was someone who knew Chuck well and was allowed in. This belief was reinforced after it was established that the crime was not committed for robbery, as none of the valuable items in the house had been disturbed. After the investigators meticulously examined the crime scene and confirmed that the crime was not committed out of robbery, and that the perpetrator knew the victim personally and sought revenge, they began a series of inquiries into the victim's past and his relationships with those around him to identify possible suspects. Chuck was living in that home with his wife, Carol Gold, who had been his partner for over 14 years, along with their son, Kenneth Quinty, known as Ashton, who was 20 years old. It was no secret that Chuck's relationship with his wife and son was extremely troubled due to his numerous romantic affairs, as it was impossible for him to be satisfied with just one woman. Chuck's nature and his multiple relationships made him a terrible husband for any woman, and he had failed in 4 marriages before meeting Carol in early 1979. At that time, Chuck was 36 years old, managing horse stables near Lake Geneva in Chicago and putting on theatrical performances reflecting the life of the old American West. A rapid love affair developed between Chuck, the successful stable manager, and the beautiful young Carol. They dated for a while before marrying and living together. Carol brought her son Kenneth, who was then a small child, to live with her in her new husband's home. In 1983, the couple made a decisive decision to relocate to Phoenix, Arizona, after Chuck purchased several horse stables there and began managing his business himself. Along with this move, Chuck resumed his relationships with other women and made no effort to hide these affairs from Carol. During their investigations, detectives noticed that everyone around the victim was aware of his extramarital relationships. However, Carol never demanded a divorce or separation. As investigators delved deeper, they came to a logical explanation for this. They realized that Carol had no source of income other than the money she received from Chuck, and she did not own a home or have family to turn to in case of separation, which would have rendered her completely homeless if she had insisted on leaving him. Naturally, Carol and her son became the main suspects in the case, and therefore Carol was the first to be interrogated by the investigators. When confronted with the accusations, the woman denied any connection to the crime, insisting that she would not benefit financially from her husband's death, as everyone thought, since Chuck did not have a life insurance policy. Moreover, she pointed directly to Chuck's mistress, who was one of his employees in the horse stables. Investigators interrogated Chuck's mistress, who admitted that she had a physical relationship with her boss both inside and outside of the stables, but preferred not to reveal her name during the investigations due to her fear of being exposed to her husband, who was a close friend of Chuck's, and had introduced her to him and helped her get the job. At times, Chuck would invite his mistress and her husband to dinner at his home or go out with them alongside his wife Carol, reflecting the intertwining of their relationships. Chuck's mistress helped investigators understand the strained nature of Chuck's relationship with his wife, as Chuck shared all the details of his relationship with her from his personal perspective. She explained to investigators that the crisis between Chuck and Carol began after the latter expressed her unwillingness to share her bed with him, which led Chuck to seek alternative companionship outside of marriage. However, the most significant detail Chuck's mistress mentioned was Chuck's troubled relationship with his wife's son, which she was well aware of, given that Ashton was also employed at Chuck's stables. The woman explained that Ashton was a financial burden on the entire project, as he was paid a hefty salary without caring for his responsibilities at work or completing the tasks assigned to him. The mistress pointed out in her conversation with investigators that Chuck had confided in her during a phone call that occurred a day before the crime that he intended to fire Ashton, disregarding the feelings of his mother regarding this decisive decision. Investigators also spoke with other employees at the horse stables, who confirmed the mistress's statements regarding Ashton. Some indicated that Ashton was a drug addict and often smoked substances while working at the stables, affecting his performance and the safety of others. The young man made no effort to hide these harmful practices from his colleagues or even from Chuck himself, who had caught him in the act of drug use at work multiple times. These immature and reckless behaviors regularly displayed by Ashton created a constant source of conflict between Chuck on one hand and Carol and Ashton on the other. Despite all the issues he caused for the family, Ashton made no attempt to improve his behaviors or harmful actions, and it reached a point where he asked Chuck and Carol to cover a large sum of money he owed to a local drug dealer, after the latter threatened him with death if he did not pay up. Additionally, investigators learned through their inquiries and interviews with people close to Chuck that he was completely fed up with his stepson's behavior and wanted to find a way to get rid of him. However, he soon realized that Carol would never abandon her son, no matter what, which made him seriously consider divorce from Carol to rid himself of both her and her son in one go. Unfortunately, he passed away before he could formally file for divorce. Investigators were convinced that Carol and Ashton were somehow involved in the plot that led to Chuck's brutal death. However, they could not find any strong material evidence supporting this theory. As Ashton and Carol insisted on their denial, the investigators' options grew dimmer, and gradually, despair began to creep into their hearts as the case started to lose its momentum and importance for them and the public. This remained the case until the Phoenix police executed a raid on the home of a local drug dealer, where they fortuitously discovered several pieces of evidence related to Chuck's murder, renewing hope for the investigative team. Robert Breyer, known as Bob, a 33-year-old notorious criminal with a lengthy criminal record of drug dealing and use, was the subject of a police report indicating that he had resumed distributing synthetic heroin in the city, leading to the issuance of a warrant for his arrest and a comprehensive search of his home. At Bob's house, investigators uncovered a large quantity of illicit drugs, along with live ammunition. When they analyzed the bullets, it became clear they were of the same type used to shoot Chuck dead in his home. But what was the nature of the relationship between Bob and Chuck that might drive him to shoot Chuck in such a brutal way? To answer this question, investigators consulted one of the informants cooperating with them in drug enforcement. The informant clarified that Bob had asked to be driven to Chuck's house on the night of the crime. Regarding the relationship between Chuck and Bob, the informant informed investigators that Bob had ongoing dealings with Ashton, Chuck's stepson, who was a regular customer of Bob's for purchasing drugs. With this information, the picture became clear for investigators, and they finally managed to outline a timeline of events. They suspected that Ashton and Carol had enticed Bob with money to carry out the crime. In this case, Carol would secure her share of her husband's inheritance, ensuring that he could not kick her and her son out onto the street as he intended. Following these developments, investigators obtained warrants to arrest Bob Breyer, Carol Gold, and Ashton Quinty, charging them with first-degree murder. However, the three defendants insisted on their innocence and refused to acknowledge any of the charges against them. Due to the lack of strong material evidence collected by investigators, they had no choice but to release them and drop the charges against them. Shortly afterward, Bob Breyer was arrested again on drug dealing charges. This time, Bob decided to confess his role in the crime that cost Chuck his life in exchange for a deal with the prosecution to receive a reduced sentence. Under this deal, Bob was willing to testify against both Carol and Ashton in court. In his confession to investigators, Bob clarified that Ashton frequently complained to him about his oppressive and annoying stepfather, who did not hesitate to hurt his mother's feelings by cheating on her with countless women, including his mistress, whom he forced Carol to meet regularly with him. Ashton hated Chuck intensely and yearned to get rid of him, but he did not have the courage to make this decision on his own because he knew well that his mother would not approve. However, the mother's position changed suddenly after she realized that Chuck was indeed about to dispose of her and her son. Bob told the police that Carol was the one who urged Ashton to pressure him to get rid of Chuck as soon as possible, indicating that she had met with him multiple times to ensure that the job would be done perfectly and promised to pay him $20,000 after the job was completed. Furthermore, Carol devised a plan to eliminate her husband herself to ensure that everything would go as planned, carefully choosing the timing to execute the crime by coordinating with Bob to come to the house on the night of the murder, knowing full well that Chuck was attending a theatrical exhibition showcasing his skills in horse handling and the use of firearms. With Chuck absent from the house, it was easy for Ashton and his mother to facilitate Bob's entry into the home, where Bob hid in one place and waited for Chuck to return. As soon as he saw Chuck standing in the kitchen, Bob drew his gun and shot Chuck several times until he confirmed he was indeed dead, then quickly left the crime scene unnoticed. Based on these developments, police arrested both Carol and Ashton again, and in August 1997, they were charged with conspiring to eliminate Chuck Gold. In the middle of the trial, Ashton realized that his conviction on the charges against him was almost certain following Bob's testimony. Ashton informed his lawyer that he was willing to strike a plea deal with the prosecution to avoid a life sentence. Under this deal, Ashton received an 18-year prison sentence and was ultimately released in September 2011 at the age of 39. As for Carol Gold, she continued to deny any connection to the crime, and her attorney urged the jury not to heed Bob's testimony, arguing that he resorted to such tactics to secure a lighter sentence, as he was well aware that the authorities were determined to implicate Carol in the crime and would do anything to achieve this goal, even if it meant striking a deal with a dangerous criminal like Bob. However, it was evident that the defense strategy employed by Carol and her attorney failed to convince the jury of her innocence, leading to her eventual conviction for first-degree murder and sentencing to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Carol was released on parole after paying bail in early 2023 when she was 84 years old. After all these years, Carol still insists on her innocence regarding the charges against her and asserts that she had no involvement in the crime. Interestingly, the actual perpetrator and shooter who took it upon himself to take the victim's life was the first to be released from prison, gaining his full freedom on February 6, 2007. This peculiar detail in the case raises the question posed by Carol Gold's defense team. Was it fair for the jury to rely on the testimony of a convicted criminal in convicting Carol? Could his testimony be considered credible given his aim of reducing his sentence? What do you think, dear viewers? Do you believe that justice was served in this case? Share your opinions in the comments below, and don't forget to support us with a like and subscribe to the channel to receive all updates.